Welcome back, guys. Today we're going to be looking at evidence of evolution. So previously we've looked at how we measure evolution. We've looked at the mechanisms that can cause evolution. We've looked at kind of an introductory piece to evolution, kind of where these ideas have come from. So today we're going to look at specifically some evidence pieces. So evidence of evolution. Right, and these would be things that a biologist would point to and say that, hey, this is evidence that organisms are related and that they're changing over time. So the first one that we're going to look at will be what we call fossils. And everybody knows what a fossil is, right? You've likely seen fossils of dinosaurs on TV or in museums, and we find fossils in sedimentary rock. So let's go ahead and get a look at this. So here we have a picture of a fossil, and it looks to be some sort of crocodilian or dinosaur precursor or ancestor, and we can see that it's been preserved in rock. Now, sedimentary rock is when sediments accumulate on top of a specimen and they cement together, and then they can be uncovered as weathering and erosion somewhat bring those pieces back to the surface. Now, you don't find fossils in igneous or metamorphic rock because those undergo different processes with heat and pressure where it's not going to preserve bone structure or other types of structure here. So this would be what we're looking for when we talk about a fossil. We're going to be looking at sedimentary rock. Here we have some transition fossils, and these are often helpful to try to find in the fossil record because they can link something from very long ago, like an Allosaurus, to something more modern, like a crow or a modern bird. And these transition fossils we see here in the middle and pictured over here to the left would show the accumulation of characteristics that shared ancestors might have had, giving us the link between something that seems very far away in terms of relatedness to something more modern day. So here we have the emergence of rudimentary feathers in this Sinosauropteryx, and that would be specimen, it looks like A over here. So we can find the presence of rudimentary feathers in the specimen. So again, dinosaur wouldn't have that, but birds obviously would. So the emergence of feathers happening here. And then we have veined feathers in this sample here, B. And then finally, we have these flight feathers for gliding that you would see here in specimen C down here. And then finally, we have modern birds. So these transition fossils are important because they can show a link between species or ancestors. We'll go ahead and make a note of that. So specifically, it's helpful if we can find these transition fossils. And that's helpful because it provides a link between species or ancestors. Helpful link. So number two is going to be what we call the anatomical record. So anatomical record, and that is rooted in anatomy. So these are going to be physical structures that we're going to be looking at. And the first one, we're going to look at some sub items underneath here. We're going to be looking at things called homologous structures or homologs. So homologous structures. So homologous structures are pictured here, and we can see four different mammalian species, human, cat, whale, and bat. And we see these six bones, the humerus, the radius, the ulna, the carpals, the metacarpals, and the phalanges. And we see these conserved across these four mammalian species. So it's likely that they share similar DNA in terms of creating these appendages. And this would be then evidence of shared ancestry or recent shared common ancestry. Now, they all serve different functions, but because the bone structuring is similar, that would suggest recent shared common ancestry. So what we'll do here is we'll just make a note of that. So again, homologous structures, these things are, they are features that have a common origin, but they serve different purposes. Right? And what they would suggest is some somewhat recent common ancestry. So they suggest kind of recent common ancestry. Recent, obviously a broad term in this sense. And our example here was the 6-limb kind of bone plan in mammals, in those mammals that we had pictured there. What we'll do is we'll compare homologous structures to analogous structures. So analogous structures you see on the left. So that would be like a shark's fin, a penguin's wing, or a dolphin's flipper. Those, if we look at the skeletal structure, aren't similar at all. So the DNA and the protein similarities there probably aren't nearly as plentiful as the homologous structures to the right. So there's probably a less recency in the shared ancestry amongst those three with the analogous structures. So we'll go ahead and make a note of that. We're going to say that when you compare these homologous structures with, we'll say, analogous structures, we'll say these analogous structures, these are features that appear similar due to selection. So natural selection is shaping those features to appear similar, but when we really dig in and look at the bone structure, it doesn't, they don't suggest at least recent common ancestry. Right, so again, those are anatomical features that would be using to try to show relatedness and how closely something is related to one another. So that brings us to subitem B here underneath anatomical structures, and we're going to call these vestigial structures. So vestigial structures are structures that serve little to no function, but they're left over from a recent common ancestor. So for example, here we see this pelvic bone in the whale skeleture. This is a baleen whale, and a whale has no need for this pelvis bone. It's actually not even really, critical in the skeletal structure, but yet it's left over from a recent common ancestor. And it doesn't serve really any disadvantage. There's no negative selective pressure here. It's not being selected again, so it just stays as part of the body plan. We can think of a human appendix to kind of operate similarly, right? We still have an appendix. It can become infected and enlarged and rupture, and that's a problem. But largely, many appendix don't cause issues for people, so there's not really a negative selective pressure or a selective pressure against it, so it's inherited as part of the body plan. Right? At one point, did it serve maybe a greater role in digestion, when humans had different dietary components. If you're talking about like a prehistoric type of human, perhaps. But its role is probably more minimized than maybe it once was. If you're talking, millennia or millions of years ago. So we'll go ahead and just record this so you have it. So again, vestigial structures, these are structures that serve little to no function. So they serve little to no function, but they are left over from the common ancestor, from a recent common ancestor. Recent obviously is a broad term again. So again, example here is this pelvic bone. In these baleen whales. And you could go with kind of something that hits maybe a little closer to home, and this would be the appendix, that you really don't have a large role for any longer. Let's look at item C. So again, item C, the last item under anatomical structures is comparative embryology. Comparative embryology. So here we're looking at embryos across 8 different species: fish, salamander, tortoise, chick, pig, rabbit, calf, and humans. And we can see that in very early embryo development, we see the presence of a tail through all 8, and we see this presence of this pharyngeal pouch underneath the neck or underneath the head of all 8. And that's conserved across all these species. And then what happens is certain genes are switched on or switched off, and that leads to the differentiation of cells and tissues, that tails are eliminated in some, and this pharyngeal pouch kind of changes as well. External gills down here in the salamander, and then the different respiratory systems of all these other animals here. So again, early embryo development shows the presence of conserved genes, and again would speak to somewhat recent common ancestry, or at least common ancestry, maybe not recent. So what we'll do, again, we will say that when we're talking about comparative embryology, it's exactly what it sounds like. We're going to compare early embryo development So we're going to compare early embryo development, and the things we're looking for is this pharyngeal pouch and the presence of this tail, right? And those would be items that would speak to recent common ancestry or common ancestry. Okay, finally, the third piece of evidence that we're going to cover is probably the most impactful, and these are biochemical similarities. Now, the human genome has been mapped along with the genome of many, many other species, and that's all housed in the NCBI, the National Center for Bioinformation, part of the National Institute of Health. And you can actually use that database and those servers to look at gene sequences and find the similarities of certain gene or protein sequences. It's a pretty cool thing that is open source and you have access to. So, for example, here we have a very simplified example where we have hemoglobin protein and just a really small piece of this protein, the amino acid sequences, in 5 different organisms. The more closely aligned these amino acid sequences or the more closely conserved they are between species, the more likely they are to be related. So when we look at the hemoglobin molecules and the amino acids that make up the protein, the human and the chimp have identical sequences there. So thus would you would think that they have a more recent common ancestor, whereas like the zebra and the human don't have many conserved amino acids across that four amino acid sequence. Again, it's a very small subset here that we're looking at. If you were to analyze something much larger, you would definitely have more conclusive results. But the long end of this is that the more similar the amino acid or nucleotide sequences are, the more closely related they are. So what we'll say is that similar DNA or protein sequences shows shared ancestry. Okay, I hope that's helpful, and I'll see you next time.